Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're diving into active Brownian particles in an alignment field. So, at first glance, that might sound a little bit intimidating, but trust me, it's really cool stuff. We're basically talking about these tiny particles that can, get this, they can actually move themselves through a fluid. And the crazy part is that researchers are finding that we can control them. And that could mean crazy new materials and technologies are on the horizon, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what really gets me excited about this is that it's, like a bridge between the microscopic world and what we can actually see and touch. Imagine a world with self-healing materials or even microscopic robots that can deliver medicine right to where it needs to go. That's the kind of future we're talking about.
Okay, so I'm definitely hooked now. But let's back up a bit for, those of us who aren't physicists. What exactly are these active Brownian particles? I mean, they sound like something straight out of Star Trek.
Well, they're kind of like, a model system that physicists use to understand something called active matter. And basically, unlike, passive particles that just go wherever they're pushed, active particles, they actually have their own energy source that lets them move on their own. Think about bacteria swimming around or even, a flock of birds flying together.
Okay, so I'm picturing I don't know, like a microscopic mosh pit where these active particles are just bouncing around and bumping into each other. But what makes them so special? Why are they any different from just a bunch of random particles, bouncing around?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. Even though they're constantly colliding and changing direction, they can actually cluster together. It's like they're forming little gangs, but without any actual attraction between them.
Wait, hold on. You're telling me they just decide to hang out together because they bump into each other too much? That seems kind of counterintuitive.
I know, right? It's called motility-induced phase separation, or mix. It's like the constant movement of these particles creates a kind of pressure, and that pressure is what forces them to cluster together. It's a wild concept, but it's really important for understanding how complex systems self-organize.
Okay, so we've got these microscopic moshers bumping around and forming little groups. But then what happens when we add this alignment field? Does that change things up?
Oh, yeah, that's where the real magic starts. So imagine we shine a spotlight on our mosh pit, okay? That spotlight acts like the alignment field, and it influences which way the particles are facing.
So it's like suddenly they all have a reason to move in a particular direction.
Exactly. And what's amazing is that just adding this simple alignment field can totally change how they behave. Instead of forming random clusters, they start creating these awesome patterns, like stripes or spirals.
So it's like the spotlight isn't just guiding them, it's actually choreographing the whole mosh pit. And the researchers actually saw this happening in their simulations.
Absolutely. The paper we're looking at has some really incredible visualizations. And what's even cooler is that you can actually control the types of patterns that emerge just by adjusting the strength and direction of that alignment field.
That's incredible. It sounds like we're on the verge of a whole new world of materials and tech based on controlling these tiny particles. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's dig a little deeper into how exactly this alignment field is working its magic. I'm still trying to wrap my head around how something as simple as a spotlight analogy can create such complex patterns.
It really is amazing how much complexity can come from such simple rules. So to understand how the spotlight shapes shapes the whole dance, we need to look closer at how the particles interact with each other and how that alignment field changes things.
Okay, so let's zoom in, way in. What's happening at the level of, a single particle?
Well, remember, each active particle has its own internal drive. It's got its own little motor, But at the same time, it's constantly bumping into other particles and getting jostled around by the fluid, kind of like trying to dance in a super crowded room, where everyone's moving erratically.
Oh, yeah, I can definitely picture that. So how does this alignment field change things up in that crowded room?
Okay, well, think of the alignment field as a gentle force that kind of nudges each particle to face a specific way. It's not a huge push, but it's enough to influence the overall flow.
Okay, so does that mean the alignment field makes the whole mosh pit, less chaotic?
Exactly. When the particles are more aligned, they can move more efficiently. They're less likely to have those head-on collisions and get, stuck.
Interesting. So the alignment field actually helps them move around more freely.
Yeah, and that has a big impact on how they cluster together. Remember that motility-induced phase separation, the MIPS? Well, the alignment field can actually change the balance between the dense phase
Oh,
and the
yeah.
less dense phase.
Okay, so it's like the spotlight's not just influencing the individual particles. It's actually affecting the whole vibe of the mosh pit.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
So does that mean it's like making it more or less likely for those groups to form?
Exactly. And here's the really cool part. This effect isn't, linear. There's a tipping point, what we call a critical point, where even a small change in the alignment field can have a huge impact on how the whole system behaves.
Okay, now you're getting into some physicsy terms there. Can you break that down a little? What exactly is this critical point and why is it important?
Sure, imagine you're slowly dimming the lights in our mosh pit. At some point, it gets so dark that the dancers can't see each other anymore, and the whole thing falls apart. That's kind of what the critical point is like. It's the point where the system can't maintain that organized structure, and it shifts into something totally different.
So by messing with the alignment field, the researchers can actually control where that critical point is.
Exactly. And by doing that, they can fine-tune the balance between those different phases. They can make the clusters bigger or smaller, or even make them completely disappear.
Wow, that's some serious control. But we've been talking about these clusters a lot. What about those stripes you mentioned earlier? How do those fit in?
Ah, yes, the stripes. They're a really cool example of how the alignment field can bring order to, all that chaos.
Okay, I'm all ears. Let's talk stripes.
Okay, so imagine our spotlights now creating a long, narrow beam across the mosh pit. The dancers, they're influenced by that beam, so they tend to align their movements along that direction. And as they move and bump into each other, they can start forming those long parallel lines.
So are you saying those stripes are like a direct result of the particles aligning themselves with the field?
Exactly. But it gets even more interesting. The researchers found that these stripes don't just, sit there. They actually grow and change over time.
So it's like the choreography is evolving, even though the dancers are following the same basic steps.
That's a great way to think about it. And the speed at which those stripes grow is directly linked to the strength of the alignment field. So the stronger the field, the faster the stripes grow.
So it's like the brighter the spotlight, the faster those lines of dancers form and stretch across the floor. That's pretty wild.
It is. And the really cool thing is that this growth follows a specific mathematical pattern. It's not just random, there's an underlying order to it.
Okay, now you're making me wish I'd paid more attention in physics class. But before we get too deep into the math, can we bring this back to, the real world for a second? We've been talking a lot about these like abstract ideas, but I'm curious to know what it all means for the future of technology and materials.
That's a great point. It's easy to get, lost in the fascinating details of the physics. But the big goal here is to use these principles to create new and innovative materials.
Okay, so how do we get from dancing particles to, let's say, a self-healing material or a microscopic robot? How do we actually make these ideas work in the real world?
That's the real challenge, right? Like we can see these amazing patterns in the simulations, but actually making it work in the real world, that's where the real excitement is.
Right, it's one thing to see it on a computer screen, but how do we actually like bridge that gap and make it real?
Well, it all comes down to, finding the right materials and the right techniques to translate those theoretical principles into actual, like, tangible technologies. It's like, we've learned the dance moves. Now we need to find the right dancers and the right stage to, bring it to life.
Okay, I like that analogy. So what are some of the dancers and stages that are looking promising right now?
One area that's really exciting is using these things called colloids. They're basically tiny particles, like, suspended in a fluid, kind of like fat droplets in milk. And the cool thing about colloids is that we can actually like engineer them. We can give them specific properties, like attach little motors to them so they act like, those active particles we've been talking about.
So we're basically creating our own like custom-made active particles.
Exactly. And by tweaking the properties of the colloids and the fluid they're in, we can actually start recreating those same patterns and behaviors we see in the simulations.
That's wild. So we've got our dancers. What about the stage? How do we create the right environment for them to do their thing?
That's where things get really, really interesting. We can use things like microfluidic devices, which are basically like tiny channels etched onto a chip. And they let us create these super precise environments for the colloids to move around in. We can even create like gradients in the fluid or use external fields like, magnetic fields or electric fields to kind of steer them in the right direction.
So it's like we're building these microscopic obstacle courses for them to navigate.
Yeah.
And by changing the course, we can control the patterns they form.
Exactly. And by combining these advanced materials and techniques, we're starting to see some really exciting results. Like researchers have already created self-assembling structures, little chains or clusters of colloids that can respond to external stimuli.
Okay, now we're talking. So how does this translate into those futuristic applications like the self-healing materials and microscopic robots we were talking about before?
Well, imagine a material that could like repair itself, just like our skin does. Using these active colloids, we might be able to create a material that can like sense damage and then send those colloids to the damaged area to fix it.
Whoa. So it's like having a built-in repair crew at the microscopic level. That's amazing.
Mm.
What else?
Another really exciting area is targeted drug delivery. Like, imagine these tiny biocompatible robots powered by active colloids that could travel through your bloodstream and deliver medicine right to specific cells.
That would be incredible for treating things like cancer, right? No more, harsh side effects from chemo affecting the whole body.
Exactly. These tiny robots could be programmed to, like, only target the cancer cells and leave the healthy cells alone.
This all sounds amazing, but how far off is it, really? Is this something we might actually see in our lifetime?
It's hard to say for sure, but the progress is happening so fast. I mean, the potential is definitely there. And with more research and development, I think we'll definitely see some game-changing applications of active matter in the next few years.
It's pretty mind-blowing to think that we're, like, on the edge of this massive shift in material science and technology, all thanks to these tiny self-propelled particles.
Yeah, it just goes to show that sometimes the smallest things can have the biggest impact. And that's what makes science so cool. There's always something new to discover, something that could change the world.
Well, I'm definitely feeling inspired after this deep dive. A huge thank you to you for joining us and sharing your expertise.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners, thank you for tuning in to The Deep Dive. We hope you enjoyed exploring the fascinating world of active matter with us. Until next time, stay curious,